The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. This is Doug Johnson with the California Invasive Plant Council, and on the Executive Committee for the National Association of Invasive Plant Councils, and we are holding this webinar on invasive plant listing. We'll be going for a couple of hours. I have an agenda coming up on the slide, but the second part of the webinar is meant to be an open discussion, and so we'll be unmuting folks for that. In the meantime, if you have questions, Chuck, you can chime in if the question deal or the chat deal is the best place to do that. But go ahead and throw your information in there and we'll get to questions along the way. Chuck, do you have a preference there between the questions or the chat?
I think they can only see the questions, so do it on their questions and then we'll have a list of them. We can check them off as we answer them.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, so if anybody has any problems with the webinar technology, go ahead and put them there as well, and Chuck will do his best to help you deal with them. So I have a few slides to introduce the topic, and then we'll kick it over to our four presenters, and then we'll have the discussion. Listing invasive plants is one of the main functions that exotic pest plant councils, invasive plant councils across the country have had. It's one of their reasons for being in the first place, is to make sure that there is science-based information on what is an invasive plant, what sorts of threats they pose. And so it's a topic that's been discussed off and on forever inside of IPCs, and then also through the National Association of IPCs. And today we're having a conversation both to remind ourselves of the topic and of the variety of approaches out there, but also to look at the possibility that we might take a next step toward making our lists able to talk to each other across state borders, so that we can look at the landscape level across the country and eventually across the continent to see how invasive plants are being listed in particular states. So just a quick background on the National Association of Invasive Plant Councils. Many of you on the phone are probably on the boards of your state or regional invasive plant council, but for anyone who's not up to speed with what the National Association is, we are basically an association of all of the IPCs. The president of each board or the chair of each board basically comprises, all of those as a set comprise the National Association, and through that network we get information out and take information in. So it's all volunteer. The role of National IPC is to, of course, support IPCs across the country, and the map to the right shows the latest map from the website na-ipc.org of where IPCs are, to coordinate national efforts, which is what today's webinar is part of, and to track federal policy. So to the degree that we can keep up with things that are going on in DC, often through the National Environmental Coalition on Invasive Species, which involves environmental NGOs, we try to have a voice on invasive species issues of relevance. On the website, na-ipc.org, there are lists of all the IPCs across the country. There is a map of SISMAs and collaborative invasive species management areas and cooperative weed management areas. There is a list of state councils, so formal interagency state councils on invasive species. And then there's a tab that has a start on links to the lists for each IPC. And that's really to the heart of what we're talking about today. So today's introduction, I'm going by just my one name apparently. So the introduction for 15 minutes or so, and then presentations from four folks. There are lots of other people out there, as I was reminded by responses to my email question to the National IPC listserv. There are lots of folks out there who are experts on listing, which is great. We have four of them today, giving a sense for the variety of listing approaches out there. And then followed by a discussion on what it might look like to mesh lists nationally. And that doesn't mean have them all be the same or anything like that. I think one of the really obvious realizations or reminders from hearing back from various states about their listing processes is that they are unique and appropriately so to address local conditions. But what we're looking at is there a way to crosswalk between them so that we can also benefit between states, not just within a state. And then at the very end, I would like to find out if there is critical mass of individuals interested in working together on pushing this forward. And this can be defined by that group, but I would see it looking at the idea of how to crosswalk amongst lists nationally, and then also just support the strength of each list. As you may remember, several years back, National IPC worked really hard on developing guidelines for invasive plant listing, and I'll mention that a little bit in a moment. And then we'll adjourn at 3 o'clock Eastern. So our meeting goals are to support IPC's maintaining lists. So hopefully, if nothing else, from our 4 presenters, you will gain an understanding of what some of the strong lists out there are, excuse me, are based on. But then also this idea of taking a step towards meshing these state lists nationally. So why do we have lists? There probably are more reasons, but the main ones that come to mind for me are, one, to inform land managers. So if I'm managing a open space or a natural area or forest, understanding which plants are problematic and having as much information about those plants as possible, what kind of impacts they have, how they spread, how I might control them, et cetera. And secondarily, to inform landscaping. So we want to prevent invasive plants from coming in. Horticulture is one of the main pathways. And so to inform our regulations or just our voluntary guidelines about what is safe to use in landscaping. There are legal lists and there are non-legal lists. So IPC lists tend to be, but aren't always, informational, and they're often, almost always, I would say, focused on weeds of natural areas and ecological impacts, and the ratings are based on impacts. Whereas state noxious weed lists, for instance, typically come out of departments of agriculture and are maybe focused on agriculture and not environment, although they might include both. And often the ratings A, B, C are based on the feasibility of eradication, so more distribution-based than impact-based, and they're regulatory. Now, I understand this does not in any way fully capture the range of different systems out there. I was just reading Kelly Kern's email about Wisconsin and how their list works, and I know Teresa is going to talk about Ohio's and how, you know, there's kind of an amalgamation of these efforts. So that's a really interesting aspect to explore more. There are at least 2 distinct types of assessment. One is we've got this invasive plant here, how bad is it? So it's post-border, it is here already, and we're describing the impact that it's currently having. And that's typically the main focus of IPC lists. Then there's pre-border or predictive lists. So we don't have this weed, but we're aware of it and we think it could come here, and we want to know how, we want to predict how bad we think it would be if it does come here. So that informs prevention. And then there are other things that people might add into their lists, like ease of control. So does a list categorize weeds just in terms of how much harm they cause, or does it also include things like how hard is it or easy is it to control? Or does it have benefits? Is it you know, economically important, and that kind of thing? So you're looking at benefits as well as damage. So a key resource that I mentioned earlier that started out as an effort to develop an ASTM standard for listing invasive plants, and then it morphed towards maybe an effort at USDA APHIS. It finally ended up as a simple document that is published on, posted on the National IPC website that is the National IPC checklist for invasive plant listing. And it consolidates the information that was developed during that process of talking about an ASTM listing. And so it includes two main things. It includes kind of a compilation of the content that a list should look at. So the ecological factors that should be evaluated in a listing process. And then it talks about the process itself and how to make sure that you've got scientific credibility, to make sure that you have stakeholder input and entities, especially including the horticultural trade, don't feel left out of the listing process, because that list may have some implications, either direct or indirect, for landscaping guidelines. And that's their bread and butter and livelihood and passion, their vocation. So it's really important that they be involved in the listing process. So this idea of linking lists or meshing across the country, the need that that we see is to look at each weed's severity across the continent, not just, we know if we're managing it in our park or in our state, at whatever level we're managing it, we want to know where it is and isn't. We want to know where it could grow, where it's spreading, where the leading edge is. So we want to be able to look at that nationally and continentally as well. And the reason to be able to do that is to better plan land management, and also to be able to inform the public and decision makers. And the way we would do that is to crosswalk between state lists. And I think we, over the listserv, realize that, what the very simplest crosswalk of all is just, does this state list this plant as invasive or not? Or maybe they don't have a list, but if they have a list, is this plant on it or not? That would be the simplest crosswalk of all. Okay, well, I have a few more slides to talk about after our presenters, but at this point, I would like to introduce our presenters. And I realize that because my PowerPoint is up the way it is, my document is not where it needs to be. Aha, okay. So our first speaker is Tony Coop. Tony is a plant ecologist with, let me get this out of the way. Too many windows. Tony Coop is a plant ecologist with the US Department of Agriculture in their Plant Epidemiology and Risk Analysis Laboratory, and he's the team lead for APHIS's weed risk assessment activities. And Tony has been really generous in sharing his expertise with IPCs across the country, and many of us have learned a lot from him. So I'm thrilled to have him kicking this off and kind of laying the foundation for what's done at the national level. So to switch screens, Tony, you gonna grab it or am I gonna send it?
Let me see if I can grab it. All right, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, all right, well, thanks everybody for coming in and joining us for this discussion about weed lists. I'm going to be talking today about sort of our federal perspective and focusing in on how weed assessments support federal weed listing, but also other potentially weed lists as well. So APHIS, our mission is to prevent the introduction and the spread of noxious weeds in the U.S. So by definition, our weed lists are going to focus on weeds that are either not yet here or are here and have a limited distribution, because we regulate weeds. We have federal regulatory weed lists. We have two major categories of regulated weeds. The first is our federal noxious weed list, which is composed right now, contains about 111 taxa. These plants are regulated and they have a zero tolerance policy. In order to bring them into the country, you need a specific permit to bring them in, or to actually even move them in interstate commerce. Generally, permits are only granted for research or other unusual circumstances. Our authority for regulating noxious weeds originally came from the Federal Noxious Weed Act of '75, but then the Plant Protection Act of 2000 sort of pulled together various laws into one place to give us one comprehensive authority. But we listed our first plants on the federal noxious weed list in 1976 and have added more to that list every 5 to 10 years. The official list is located in our, let me get my laser pointer out here, is located in the Code of Federal Regulations, but we also have a list on the web, and we also have some assessments available on the web. The second category of regulated plants is our NAPRA pest plants. NAPRA stands for Not Authorized Pending Pest Risk Analysis. This is a regulatory category under our Plants for Planting reg, and it basically relates to those kinds of plants. So we're saying if some importer wants to bring in these plants that are on this list, then we say no, you can't bring them in right now until we more fully evaluate them. And based on that evaluation, we may decide to either keep them on the list, potentially maybe regulate them as noxious weeds, or take them off the list. Currently, there are 53 species on that list that are regulated as weeds. The first plants that were added to this list were added in 2013. We added some more in 2017, and just last November, we proposed to add another 26 species. The official NAPRA list is on the web, plus all of the NAPRA data sheets that are used to support that listing. Now, in APHIS, we use weed risk assessments and weed assessments in general to support any kind of listing or delisting activity. And so we use a diverse range of tools. Doug talked to you already about there being two types of assessments. Weed risk assessments are predictive or pre-border tools. Risk assessment in general evaluates the probability of some adverse event. That could be any event that you want to define, but in our case, it's the probability that a plant is going to be introduced, established, naturalized, and then spread across the environment. And of course, it's also an evaluation of the consequences of that event. So by definition, these types of assessments focus on species that are not yet here or recent introductions for which we really don't know anything about them or what they might do. Generally, weed risk assessments are used to identify targets for exclusion, for regulatory lists, and other types of lists. The second, let me move this. Oops. Can you guys still see my presentation?
Yeah.
I can't see it anymore. Let me see, how do I get it back? 1 second.
We can always read your slides to you.
Yeah, no, here we go. I got it. Okay. So the second type of assessments are weed status assessments, which are descriptive or post-border analyses. These typically focus on plants that are already invasive and weedy, so we have no need to evaluate them to see if they're going to become invasive because we know that they are invasive. Instead, they really focus to describe how bad they are, where they are they difficult to control. These kinds of assessments are used to develop informational lists, to identify species for research, or to prioritize management activities. There's a lot of overlap between these types of assessments that they may look a lot alike because they use the same kinds of questions, but it's ultimately how they're designed and how they are used. I think a lot of IPC assessments probably fall under the weed status assessment category, but some of them are probably a little bit more like hybrids of the two. And of course, there are other kinds of tools out there that don't quite neatly fit these two. Now, going back to the federal side, when we use a tiered weed evaluation process to evaluate a plant. When a plant first comes across our desk, we run it through a screening and prioritization process, which just takes about 20 minutes. The goal of this step is to see, does this plant meet our criteria, fall within our scope? If the plant is native, if it's widely established, if it's widely cultivated, it really falls outside of our scope. But if it doesn't, we then prioritize it for further evaluation. And so the next step would be a weed characterization. This is a simple, open-ended narrative process. I usually tell people spend no more than a day on it. Our goal here is to just skim the literature to see what are the most important features of this plant. And that will help us then decide whether or not we should pursue this one, whether or not this could be a candidate for listing. If we think it would be good for the NAPRA list, then we will develop a NAPRA data sheet from that weed characterization and then propose it for NAPRA listing. If we need more information about the species, or if we think it's a good candidate for the federal noxious weed list, we will then proceed with the weed risk assessment, which is our most detailed assessment. And it usually takes anywhere from a week to 2 weeks, depending on the complexity of the species. Recently, we also developed a weed status assessment, which I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. So our weed risk assessment process is a semi-quantitative assessment. It's a predictive model that was validated with 204 U.S. species. That means it has a certain accuracy rating. It is conducted in an Excel file, but it's all put together and assembled in a Word document. It briefly summarizes nomenclature of the plant, some botanical information, and describes its foreign and domestic status. But it also focuses then in on the elements of the species risk. There are two key outputs from our assessment. First is the species risk potential and uncertainty, shown in this graph, where we have here establishment spread potential on the x-axis and impact on the y. The species risk score is shown by this black point right here in the middle of the graph, and everything else, and you can see it falls in the high risk region. And the other 204 points on here describe this, the risk scores of the species that were used to validate the model. The box describes the amount of uncertainty we have in the assessment. The higher the uncertainty level, the larger the boxes. And essentially what we do is we run a simulation based on our uncertainty to say what other risk scores are possible if we were to change some of our answers. And in this case, it says that, well, despite our uncertainty, we continue to get high risk results. And so we can be pretty confident of our main results of high risk. It's pretty stable, right? All right, the next core result is an analysis of the species' geographic potential in the U.S., sort of a climate analysis. And we look to see where the species occurs around the world, and then figure out where those climatic variables, 3 climatic variables, match up in the U.S. And we also incorporate uncertainty by showing you these different colors. So anything that's colored in this graph, we deem the climate there to be suitable for that species. But the darker the color, the more certain we are that that is a good climate match. In this case, the southeast is a really good climate match for this aquatic plant, Lanophila. But the Ohio region, Midwest region up here, is in pale pink. The climate is still suitable, but it's really, we're talking about it's on its edge of suitability. And the other thing we show on this graph is the current known naturalized distribution of the species at the county level, shown by these little county hatch marks. All right, so once we complete an assessment, a draft assessment, it then goes through a review and revision process. The first goes through peer review by others in our lab. It's then revised. It then goes through editorial review, revision, and then administrative review. And it's revised again until finally it's cleared and then made publicly available to everyone. Our decision makers read these assessments and then they decide whether or not the species should be considered for listing. Now, just because it comes out high risk doesn't mean that they're going to propose it for listing. They may decide that the distribution in the U.S. is too wide, or the plant has some beneficial properties, or whatever. So the assessment does not drive necessarily the result, but it is an important part of the decision. If they do decide to list it, it then enters a federal rulemaking process where a proposed rule is published in the Federal Register. And then we invite people, stakeholders, to comment on either the assessment or the proposed rule to list it, whatever. And we usually give people a period of about 30 to 90 days to comment on the rule. And then we will take it, review the comments, and decide whether or not we should proceed with listing based on the comments we get from stakeholders. If we do end up listing it, then the final rule is published saying why we listed it and how we felt about the stakeholders' comments, if there were any. Now, as I told you before, our federal noxious weed list is kind of old, and some species have been on there for 40 years now. And so we decided it's probably time that we should start reviewing some of these species in case some of them we should now pull off the list because they become too widely distributed in the U.S. or maybe they haven't become problematic. So, but we couldn't evaluate them with our standard weed risk assessment process because it'll continue to come out high risk because that our assessment was designed to be predictive, right? So we needed a different type of assessment to help us with this. So we developed a qualitative narrative-based assessment that answers three key questions. First of all, based on the biology of the species and its current and potential distributions in the U.S., is it likely to spread into new regions? Second, is the species likely to cause additional impacts in the U.S., or has it already reached its maximum levels of impact? And finally, is it being controlled or managed in the U.S.? You know, we have some federal noxious weeds that no one is really doing anything about. Turns out that they did not become problematic in the U.S., and so no one is really controlling them. So our decision makers will take a look at this information, which these documents are short 5-page documents. They don't include any recommendations, but they'll look at them and then decide whether or not they should be delisted. And if they think they should be, they'll first consult with the state, and then if they still think it should be delisted, then we will proceed with the rulemaking process. Now, we haven't done this for any of them yet. I think only 1 or 2 weeds, federal noxious weeds, have ever been delisted. But we are certainly right now looking to try to update the list. So, any questions or comments?
So,
I don't know.
do you have any, Chuck? I don't know if you're watching the question line or the chat line, but do you see anything there?
No, not yet.
Yeah, we do have a few questions if you want me to go through them.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So the first one is there a central library of weed risk assessments that we can use to help with nominating more noxious weeds in our state?
Nominating species for state lists or for federal lists?
The question was state lists.
And regardless, Tony, I think the question is there a repository somewhere? Is there a place where one can access all sorts of risk assessments or status assessments that have been done?
Yeah, well, yes. On the federal side, we do have a website where we list all of the assessments that we have done or cooperators have done for us. Now, we don't have assessments for all of our federal noxious weeds because some of these were listed in the 70s and 80s and 90s before there were even assessments being done anywhere in the world. But today we do assessments for all of them, and we make those available on our website. And other people who do weed risk assessments, such as University of Florida, and Dia's going to talk about that, the University of Hawaii folks, they do have websites where those assessments are available as well.
So I think one of the potential needs that I'm jotting down is a single clearinghouse where one can say plant X, tell me who has assessed it and where I can look at that. So without going to multiple places to look for it, is there a way to have a universal access point? Other questions, Chuck?
why are plants like garlic mustard and stiltgrass not on the federal noxious weed list?
Correct.
And
They
I
are
guess
not.
as a follow-up, if a plant is not, if a plant is on the federal list, what does that mean with regard to nurseries in the U.S. growing and selling them, or being able to buy them on the internet and having them shipped in?
Okay, so if a plant is on the federal noxious weed list, then you cannot import it into the U.S. and you cannot move it in interstate commerce. Now, if it's grown within a state and sold within that state and moved only within that state, we have no authority. That falls to the state. But if the state doesn't adopt the federal noxious weed list, or if they don't list that species themselves, then nothing will be done at the state level. Now, our list is both regulatory, but some people also view it as sort of an informational list. And so if it is listed, they'll try not to perhaps grow it or sell it within their state. But we don't have any authority within the individual states, only when it crosses state lines in trade.
Any more questions, Chuck?
Yeah, a couple more. What software is used to determine the climate suitability of the species in the U.S.?
Yeah. We use ArcGIS. It's not a fancy model. It's pretty simple. We look at the species distribution with respect to plant hardiness zones, Köppen-Geiger climate classes, and annual precipitation. DIA and their folks are working to improve the model a little bit by incorporating elevation as well, but I expect you'll be talking perhaps a little bit about that.
And then when you consult with states, how is that done? And who do you go to in the states?
We will consult with the National Plant Board, which is composed of all the state departments of agriculture.
And then I guess to clarify, Tony, a little bit more, why would species like garlic mustard and stiltgrass not be on the federal list?
Because our focus is to prevent the introduction and the spread of species. We focus on species that are not yet here. Once the species has become established, then it's really up to the state to control it and other people within the states, other groups. We are only focused on preventing introductions and that first initial spread of the species.
There's a few more, but let's keep moving and we can come back to these later.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. This is all very fascinating about how the lists are made and then how the lists are used. And certainly there are complexities in each of our states and in the federal list. Let's go on to our next speaker. Dia Lawrence is Assistant Extension Scientist with the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, and she leads their assessment of non-native plants in Florida's natural areas. And she is the new board chair for the newly named Florida Invasive Species Council. Did I get that right, Dia?
Yep.
All right, well, congratulations on the name change and on being the board chair. Thanks for doing that.
Great. Can you guys see my screen?
We're seeing the one, the presenter view as opposed to the, yeah, I had to switch mine.
And did you, I see.
When I did it, there was a button at the top that said switch. Switch
Okay.
the, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Good? Yeah.
I just saw the U.S. women's national team. Very exciting.
I am a fan. We can talk about that later.
All right.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation and participating in this webinar. You know, I never thought 7 years ago when I left Ohio, I would become so passionate about plant lists and, making sure that, assessments are correct and these kind of things. So it's exciting for me to participate on a national level here. I'm going to focus the most on the UF-IPC assessment, which is the program that I oversee at the University of Florida. But I am going to take just a slide each for the Florida Invasive Species Council and the FDAC's state noxious weed listing process. Just a side note on the Invasive Species Council name change. We were planning on launching that at our annual meeting this year, but we had to cancel due to coronavirus. But looking forward to getting some branding out there and trying to get folks to accept the name change. But formerly FLEPC, now we're FISC, and at this point we're still plants focused. But we opened it up to go all tax at some point in the future. So just a little piece of news there. But just to talk about the IPC assessment, essentially we have 3 tools, and this is going to be maybe a little repetitive after Tony's presentation. But we use a predictive tool to evaluate the risk before species enter the state. And then we also have a status assessment that evaluates species that are already here. I found the easiest way to describe this is to describe it as diagnosing the invasion. So we want to identify what a species is doing within the natural areas of Florida. And then our final tool is the infra-specific taxon protocol, which is a mouthful. We just call it the ITP. This evaluates the invasion risk of cultivars. So think hybrids, varieties, cultivars of known invaders. And so the predictive tool model that we're using at the moment is based on the Australian weed risk assessment. 49 questions, been modified for Florida, where we've changed questions related to the climate, the precipitation, and the soil type. We evaluate the species, again, that are new to the state. And then we have another category. We use this tool when a species is being proposed for a new use. So the IPC assessment has been written into state policy with the biomass planting rule or non-native planting rule. Originally it was for biofuels, but it's been expanded for all non-native species that are to be planted in 2 or more acres on a property. So we do the weed risk assessments for those, as well as the species that are new to the state. At this time, we have about 200 species in our database, and all of those are available online, including, we did one for beach vitex. It was a species that we only had a few records in the state. So it was already present here, but it was in limited distribution that we wanted to predict what it was going to do in the rest of the state. Again, all of those reports are available online. Our second tool is the status assessment. And again, this is for species that are already here. We have the state divided into 3 zones because, as you can imagine, it would be very different climate conditions in the Panhandle versus, South Florida or the Keys. And you can have different conclusions for each of these zones. Our tool is designed to describe ecological impacts, the potential for expanded distribution, and management difficulty. And then we do have a little bit of information that we include about the economic value of the species, although I'm not aware that this has ever changed the conclusion of a species. This tool incorporates data from field experts. So, we have like 600 species that have been evaluated with this tool. And we do revisit those and try to update them periodically. I cannot keep track of all these species across the entire state. So we really rely on the input of our experts, our land managers and other scientists around the state who are very kind and volunteer their time in providing these data. And then finally, this infra-specific taxon protocol. Again, this is cultivars, varieties, and subspecies. We want to make sure that the recommendations for the parent species do not apply. So for example, we have Ruellia simplex here, this Mexican petunia. It's pretty invasive here in North Florida into Central Florida. This is the wild type and an improved cultivar. The improved cultivar has sterility and the pollen isn't viable, but it does still spread vegetatively below ground. So this one got a conclusion of a caution. And then here at the bottom, lantana. This is a fruiting lantana with the yellow flowers. And then the Bloomify Red is a cultivar that it doesn't spread vegetatively, pollen's good, it doesn't produce fruit. So this one actually was an okay to recommend. This process is written into university policy in terms of our cultivar release process. So the first thing when they're releasing a cultivar, typically environmental horticulture uses us for this, and agronomy in some cases. They'll submit their report to me, I will do the assessment, and then it goes to the invasive plant working group where we have a roundtable, present the data, and then vote. And then it goes to the next steps in the cultivar release. But we really want to focus on whether or not these things are sterile and if that pollen is viable. We have 900 species. We launched a website, gosh, it's been about 5 or 6 years ago now, where you can filter by conclusion, zone, growth form, and the tool. And these filtered lists can be downloaded into Excel. You can access the website at assessment.ipis.ufl.edu. Here are the possible conclusions. I present this information a lot to master gardeners and garden clubs. So I found the easiest way to explain it is like a stoplight, where red means stop, yellow means proceed with caution, and green means go. For the status assessment and ITP conclusions, again, red, you'll see things like invasive no uses, or in rare occasions, I think we only have 3 species in the database. We do have approved, specified, and limited uses for those species. But these are not recommended by IPC, and we try to reassess them every 10 years just to make sure that we're keeping our files up to date. We're having all the pertinent information that's being added to it. But these will almost never go from invasive down to a caution, because at some point the status of that species is shown where it's invasive in the state. Caution, we want to express to our stakeholders that you can still plant this plant, but you want to manage to prevent the escape. We reassess those every 2 years because we want to keep an eye. We're really trying to get a handle on whether that particular species is spreading around the state. So we try to assess those every 2 years. And then finally, not a problem species. These may be recommended by IPC, reassess every 10 years. So we're comfortable that they're not invading, but we still want to kind of keep an eye on them. So every 10 years, we'll check in and make sure. I should note that at any point, if somebody is out in the field, if one of my land managers is seeing a not a problem species or caution starting to behave badly, then they can contact me and I can bump those assessments up. And then here's our predictive tool conclusions. Same color scheme, but you'll notice different language, where we have a high invasion risk, a moderate risk, and a low invasion risk. But there's the same implications for these, whether or not you can recommend them or not. I will note that within the university, all faculty and staff, when dealing with invasive with non-native species, have to follow the recommendations of the IPC assessment. And they're allowed to do research on invasive species, but any publication has to say, at least reference it, the conclusions of the assessment. But in terms of extension materials and presentations, species that fall into that red zone should not be recommended by university staff. And the yellow species, they need to be communicating that there is a risk. Before I jump any further, I actually left out the information about the geopotential models, Tony, because I didn't want to overlap with your presentation. But I just note that the predictive model that we're using is that AWRA, but we are in the process of working with Tony's group and to adopt the PPQ WRA for Florida. We found that the way that it describes risk is more. I prefer that tool because you're really showing like, here is the establishment and spread potential. Here is the impacts. I just find it to be more descriptive for our stakeholders, and we're very excited about incorporating uncertainty and geopotential modeling to our program. Now I'm going to jump to the Florida Invasive Species Council plant listing program committee. I am a member, so I'm the incoming chair, and I've been a member of the plant list committee for a few years now. So the process that we use is generally a species will be nominated with a criteria sheet. So someone will prepare a report. It contains the same information that is used in a status, something we might think of as a status assessment, but there is no scoring involved in this. We are trying to determine if a species is a category 1, where we're looking for evidence that's altering native plant communities, changing structure, that kind of stuff. A Cat 2, we're looking for evidence that it's increased in abundance or frequency, not yet altered those plant communities. So essentially someone will give us a criteria sheet. Usually it's members of the plant list committee. They will sit into the meeting, present their information, and we'll have a discussion and then reach consensus through voting. At this point, again, there's no scoring, but we've started to discuss maybe a screening tool, something to sort of add a little muscle to those criteria sheet and our recommendations. Now, this list is non-regulatory, as most council lists are non-regulatory, but it is used a lot in prioritizing management in Florida and funding, and it has been used in some of the regional community city regulation in the state. And then finally, the Florida Department of Ag and Noxious Weed Listing is very similar to the plant listing process that we use at FLEPC or FISC. Essentially, you fill out a petition, and then the Florida Department, FDACS will schedule a meeting and hear the evidence. So recently, I petitioned beach phytix to be listed. It was a species I was very excited to petition because it has such limited distribution in Florida at this time. If we can get it put on that list early, maybe we can prevent its spread around the state. So submitted the petition, we attended the meeting. I took 2 experts with me. One was a land manager and the other was an extension agent who's done a lot of outreach on the species. We presented the information, and then there was a discussion and a vote by the committee, the state agency committee. And then they sent all that decision and supporting evidence to Tallahassee. So in the last 3 years, we've gotten beach phytix, Japanese honeysuckle, and cat's claw vine to pass through that committee, but it's all gotten hung up in Tallahassee at this point. The first 2 species was the same year as Parkland and Hurricane Irma. So it just gets bounced down in prioritization. And this year, I'm guessing we won't hear much about phytix during the legislative session because of what we're dealing with now with coronavirus. So we'll see. I got my fingers crossed that we'll see those things added to the list, but we're just still waiting. But legislature has to approve this rule change, and typically they update those lists around Christmas. So I will note, just a little plug, Lynn Geddes and I prepared an extension document for the university that's a guide to the different non-native plant lists that we interact with in Florida. So we do the federal noxious weed list. There are 2 state lists. There's an aquatic and a terrestrial. FDACS is in the process of getting that aquatic list merged with the terrestrial, so we just have one. The FISC list, and then the IPC assessment. And so with that, I don't know if we have time for questions or want to. moving
Wow,
along.
so there's a lot of lists in Florida. Chuck, do you have maybe one question on Dia's presentation? Otherwise, I think we should move along for the sake of time.
One question about where do you get your info on sterility and pollen or seed viability?
So the responsibility is placed on the researchers who want to get the species or the cultivar passed. So they do all the research and pollen staining and crossing and germination studies. They have to present that data to us, and we have sent reports back and required them to do additional experiments if it was inadequate. So mostly we're working with environmental horticulture, and for example, the last Ruellia cultivars, I ended up serving on a committee for a student that was doing some of those additional experiments. So
Great.
Yeah, and then those materials for the assessments are on y'all's website, right?
yeah.
That was the next question. Getting a copy, they can just go to the Florida IPC assessment website to get those.
Yeah, that's great. If you haven't looked at that website, it's an amazing resource, and except for the fact that it's a little intimidating and may make us feel inadequate, it's a great resource and something we can stride towards. Thanks so much for the background, Dia. So next up is Teresa Cully, who's the head of the Biological Sciences Department at the University of Cincinnati, and she chairs the Ohio Invasive Plant Council's assessment team. She also serves on the Plant Advisory Committee that advises the state's Department of Agriculture on which plant species should be regulated in the state. So this is one of those hybrid systems, and Teresa's going to tell us how it works.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let me see if I can now share my screen and showing my main screen. So let me pull that bigger. There we go.
Yep, perfect.
Does that work for everyone? All right. And I've lost pictures of everyone, but I see my presentation, so we're going to go with it. So thank you, Doug, for that introduction. So what I'm going to do is show a little bit more from the state perspective, but just I want to acknowledge both of Tony and Dia's work. Is I've learned a lot from them and incorporated a lot of what they've already talked about in some of the work that we do in Ohio. So for Ohio, I just briefly wanted to go over the history, because one thing that you'll notice is we're a little unique, maybe not so unique, in that we do have a strong horticulture and landscape association. The green industry, in other words, is pretty strong in our state. Back in 2000, that's when our original list was created, and that just came about by land managers and people in natural areas where they just got together around a table and compared notes and came up with a list of species, and that became the list for the state. But there were issues that occurred, and one of those was that the nursery industry was not at the table. And so when the list came out and there was something like purple loosestrife, Lythrum salicaria, again, this is back in 2000, that was on the list. And that at the time, you know, was important for the nursery industry as a plant that was sold. And so because of that, nothing much else happened since 2000. In 2005, the Ohio Invasive Plant Council formed, and just briefly, just to, if you're not aware, this, it's really nice because it's a combination of different stakeholders in the state, as you can see here: federal, state, government, local governments, academics, so that's where I come into play, nonprofits. The nursery industry is a component of that as well, and then just the interested public. So about this time period, shortly after 2005, we started to realize that there was a need to update this list that was created in 2000, because we were getting questions like about lesser celandine, for example. You know, why isn't it on your list? So in 2008, the Ohio Invasive Plants Council decided that we needed to come up with a new list, update the list, but more so than just update, we really needed to rethink how we constructed the list. And so our purpose here was really to come up with a new protocol, a new process to inform Ohio citizens by creating a transparent, objective, and scientifically based assessment process. And that was really important, especially the scientific based portion, because we wanted something that all stakeholders in the state could buy into and could also be defensible. It was transparent, so if someone had a question about how something was rated or ranked, they could easily just see what exactly was done. The other important thing is this included all partners, specifically including the nursery industry as well. Specifically, we reached out to the Ohio Nursery and Landscape Association, the ONLA, so they were at the table for this. And I got involved shortly before 2008 and have been involved ever since. So it took a few years. There was a number of us who were working on this protocol, a lot of give and take, talking back and forth. But essentially by 2013, our protocol and accompanying policy, how this would be instituted, was approved by our board. And then it was not required, but we also wanted to get buy-in from the Ohio Nursery and Landscape Association. And so we actually had them also vote, and they voted to approve our protocol as well. Again, that wasn't required, but we thought that would make sense because we wanted them to be part of the process as well. So what our process is that essentially we have a 5-person team in the state. We have a chair, that's me, usually from academia, although I guess not necessarily required. We have 2 members who are really representing the interests of land managers, and then 2 members who represent the interests of the nursery industry. So again, that's because Ohio, we have all those different components really important in our state. Now, the scope of the overall assessment process is, early on we talked about, we should do all species, all plant species in general. But over time, we really ended up focusing on only the terrestrial species. And this was because we quickly discovered that the aquatics, it's very difficult to use the questions that we were developing on the aquatics, and the Great Lakes already has a really good aquatic assessment. So again, the focus was on terrestrials, and initially, for a long time, we focused only on those already invasive in the state. And so this is really more of that descriptive type of list that both Thea and Tony were talking about. So originally, this was not predictive, and it was not geared towards regulation. So again, only informatory. And I'm stressing this because, as you'll see in a moment, we've changed. So we've gone through a process. So just in short, I just have one slide on this. Initially, we had 2 steps of our protocol. So we had a first step, which was just our initial assessment. We had 4 questions, basically just trying to recognize if this plant was a huge problem. If it's on the noxious weed list, the federal or the state list, it for example, would immediately be put onto our invasive list, but also just trying to find those species that were already spreading and forming dense stands in Ohio. This was necessary because as we first started assessing our species, we had a whole lot of species that we were faced with. We really wanted to quickly identify those, what we call the big bad invasives, in the interest of time. Now, if a species went through the initial assessment and say it wasn't so severe, then it would go through our second step, which is a detailed assessment. This was a list of 18 questions, and this is the more typical type of assessment process. So for example, we had 3 questions based on invasion status, how widespread is it across the state, 7 questions on biological character, seed production, vegetative production, all those basic types of questions. And then 8 questions dealing with ecological impacts, spread, impacting other native animals or plants, altering ecosystem processes, succession, all those sorts of things. So based on the detailed assessment, things would be identified as either invasive, pending further review, and not invasive at this time. And then if there were 4 or more questions where we just couldn't answer, we didn't have enough information, we would have to answer unknown, and that just then came out as insufficient data. So that's how we've been doing it for a while. And also just to note, you might think the pending further review category is a little strangely worded. It is. This would be typically what I suppose other states would call a watch list. Because we were working with the nursery industry, they did not like the term watch list. And so this was essentially a point of compromise, if you will. So Using this whole process, we were able to assess at the current time, we have 75 plant species already assessed, 24 that are currently in the pipeline being assessed. We try to release about 10 or more a year. We have 36 species next, and really anyone can contact me or any member of the team with a suggestion for a species to review. That's how we get those. We do have, this is important to mention, and this is what Dia Years and I had been talking about, is one of the situations of our protocol was that cultivars were assessed individually. In other words, they were not grouped with the parental taxa. And the hope here was trying to find a cultivar that would not be invasive and that would be safe for planting, is what the hope was to have. As you'll see in a moment, that proved to be a little problematic. We do have a 6-month public review period. So once an assessment is completed, the board actually has to vote to approve, then it gets posted on our website, and a snapshot shown here. Again, emphasizing we want to make this as transparent as possible for all members of the Ohio community. We do try to reevaluate species every 3 years or so. Really what it comes down to, if we get a question, for example, princess tree, we keep having to review it because it's changing so fast. And as you might know, it's a huge problem in southern states, and it's growing, moving up into our area as well. So again, I want to emphasize that all our assessment worksheets and reference lists are on our website, and you can see that there at oipc.info. I also manage the website, and so we try to keep that up to date as much as possible. So that's where we were going. We've been doing since 2013. About 2 years ago or so, we started to realize, as we're working through all of the big bad invasives and we're coming to ones that are just starting to move into the state, that we had some challenges. One, it became very apparent that step 1 was no longer necessary. Remember, that was the step where we're just trying to identify the worst offenders. And the reason was we would skip things. So for example, purple loose-striped Lithrum salicaria, it's on the noxious weed list, so we instantly put it on our invasive list. But then later on, someone would come back and say, hey, wait a minute, we really want to know why Lithrum salicaria is, this score, and how does that compare to Lithrum virgatum or some other types of species. And so we ended up just having to run all the species through step 2 anyways. So we just decided, as you'll see in a moment, that we're just going to have to combine them all. Another interesting thing is we found out a problem with vines. Some of our questions were not quite well crafted to deal with vines, because many of them, would be on the forest floor for like winter creeper, for example, for a long period of time. Then once they hit a tree, they grow up and they start reproducing and producing fruit. And so we didn't have really good questions about that. So we ended up having to revise a specific question dealing with sexual reproduction. Now we get back to that cultivar problem. So pretty early on, we realized, as you might expect and not be surprised, is that we often lack information regarding specific cultivars. And so we tried to assess several cultivars. One, we actually were able to assess it. We had enough information where we can get through the questions without having 4 more unknowns, but for the others, we just didn't have enough information. And so that was one challenge that became a problem. The other more recent thing is that we have newly advancing invasives, and we know there are problems. So example is giant hogweed, right? So that's a huge problem. But in the state of Ohio, it doesn't really show up on many state distribution lists or anything like that, because it's removed as quickly as possible. So now we started to realize, this is where we had the informational list, and we started to realize, as our list and process is maturing, if you want to say that, what we're starting to deal with is these things that are just starting to move into the state. And so, in other words, we're starting to see the shift, or feel the urge to get a little bit more predictive. And so that was something I had never expected in the past, and it sort of developed. So these are our proposed changes. This is something that I'm still working with our Ohio Invasive Plants Council board to approve. It is under their purview to approve of these things. But again, what we've done is we've now consolidated the 2 steps. We have a total list of 19 questions total. And because of that, our list now, the scores range not from 0 to 80, but 0 to 85. In short, what has happened is if a species is on the noxious weed list, it gets 5 points, is where the 5 came from. We now group the cultivars within the species. And one of the reasons why we did that is, as you'll see in a moment, our state has moved towards regulation, and that was actually included as part of the regulatory process. And so that was really relatively easy for us to adopt then. And of course, it made perfect sense and made the assessments much more easier. So again, here the onus is really on the nursery industry if they wanted to show if a cultivar is not invasive, but otherwise the cultivars would be grouped within their parental taxa. And as you can already see, the assessment range increases as well. The other thing I want to mention is that pending category here. We're now talking about that. We don't like the name, so we're trying to come up with an additional name as well. And also, we are now flagging species of concern. So ones that those newly invading species, things like the giant hogweed and so forth, we are flagging them and starting to do that on our website. So let's see, click over to here. So I just have about 2 more slides to show you, just to give you a little bit more update on what is going on now in Ohio. Again, we have regulation. When we first started this assessment process, we purposely avoided any indication of regulation because it was such a hot topic. We really wanted to make progress where we could in coming up with an informative list. We really wanted to work with both land managers and the nursery industry, again, because those are the main components of our state, and the land managers are so important. The nursery industry, of course, is big as a economic powerhouse in the state. So we didn't work on, we just really didn't want to deal with regulation for a long time. Eventually, the Ohio Nursery and Landscape Association actually started talking with us, and they saw the value in coming up with some form of regulation because they saw what was happening in other states. And so we actually worked with them, and the result was that in 2014, the state Senate bill was approved, instituting an invasive plant regulation process. And so again, this essentially regulates the commercial sale and distribution of species. So what this does, and this is a little different than other states who went through regulation. And so what this does, and I think it's, for us at least, it's been working for the most part, is that for the Director of Ag, they have exclusive authority to regulate invasive species. And so this is through a rulemaking process through the Ohio Administrative Code. The nice thing is this means that we don't have to undergo a state vote, in the legislative house on a list. It is run through the Director of Agriculture. So this is different from the state noxious weed list. We still do have that. That's important to distinguish. We have the 2. But in 2018, those rules went into effect. Essentially, there's 2 rules. One, the first one established an initial list of 38 species. And again, cultivars are included here unless they're shown not to be invasive. The second rule was more about, okay, well, now that we have this list of 38 species, how do we go from here? And they created the Invasive Plant Advisory Committee. This committee is a 5-person team. You can see how it's broken down there. And this group meets to discuss species and propose new ones that should be added. Again, it's advisory, so it proposes those additions to the Ohio Department of Agricultural Director. And she then would make the recommendation as to whether that should go through the rulemaking process or not. So I am actually a member of this 5-person committee, so I'm the academia member as well. So you might ask, okay, well, how does this relate to our assessment process I just talked about? Well, for the regulatory process now, our group there does use the assessments that are run through the Ohio Invasive Plants Council. So those are used and sent to the team for the regulatory process. So that's what I just wanted to mention about that. Finally, one thing I want to mention, I was watching some of the questions going around, And one of the things that I think would be extremely helpful for the different states, at least from my perspective, is for states to be able to share their lists and ideally share the literature that they dig down and find for each of the assessments. And so I'm also a member of the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, MIPIN, and so on our website we've been sharing at least lists of species that are on each of the state's lists. But when we've been talking about sharing the literature, but right now we haven't done that. So if anyone has, for your state, if you've been doing a state assessment, at least for me, one of the biggest challenges is to trying to get all the literature together. And so this is something where if another state has already looked at a species and assessed it, you know, it'd be great if they can just give the assessment, but also that literature as well. So finally, just if you want to look for more information, feel free to look at our website. There's my contact information as well. The last thing I want to mention is I'm also involved in working with the public gardens. This started just in the Midwest. It's sort of grown to include all of North America. And so this is something that I'm working on with the colleagues at the Morton Arboretum to gather public garden data that they've been collecting throughout their, throughout time, to try to use that as an indication of what species might be spreading within the gardens themselves as an indication of what invasive plant councils should be looking for. So that is what I have for you right now. And
excellent. Thank you, Teresa. Well, and that final point, that is a really interesting potential partnership to have public gardens tightly tied to invasive plant councils so that they can serve as kind of an early warning system on what they see spreading. Important partners. Any questions that you see or Chuck sees that would make sense to address at this time?
And let me look. Let me switch over here. Let's see. Oh, people who want copies of specific assessment materials. If that was to me, looks like it might have been. They're all on our website, so everything is available there. You can click on a link, it will give you the Excel spreadsheet. It will also give you a link to all of the literature, the references. I can also send it to you. That's no problem at all. You could just email me and I could send that to you.
And let me read this other one to you, Teresa. Because plants are put on the noxious weed, plants that are put on the noxious weed list, okay, start again. Because plants that are put on the noxious weed list because they affect agriculture and crops, which are highly disturbed landscapes, why did you assume that noxious listing should be an automatic and important qualifier for inclusion on your list?
Yeah.
Seems like the fact, seems like each noxious weed should be evaluated for its known or potential for invasion and negative impacts to natural areas.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. And that's why originally with the step 1, if it was listed as noxious, then it automatically went as being invasive. And the reason we did that was, well, number one, a lot of the other states were doing very similar things that the other state assessments that we looked at. They're always usually the first or second question was, what is this on your noxious weed list? So we just went ahead and followed that. The revision noticed that we removed that. We still give points for being on the noxious weed list because, at least for the state of Ohio, if you're on the noxious weed list, that usually indicates that it's a big problem in terms of spreading along roadways and within municipalities and disturbed landscapes, like what Jill is saying here. So yeah, but I agree. And I get this question a lot with members of the general public because they want to know what's the difference between the noxious list and the invasive list. Some species are on both, and some species are on only one. And that comes down to more regulatory issue now for our state.
Gotcha. Great. Well, let's move on to our last speaker. Thanks for that, Teresa. That is also very, very impressive and a lot to learn from there. Our final speaker is Jutta Berger on our staff at Cal IPC. She's our science program director for the California Invasive Plant Council, and she manages our list, the inventory of invasive plants in California.
Yes, now let me see whether I can do this here. Screen share.
So I think I just made you the presenter.
My screen. And then I'd like to switch it. I think right now you're seeing just.
Yeah, go ahead and do slideshow, looks like.
Oh, yes. And then I think I need to go to display settings. So presenter. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Same thing. Okay, good. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Chuck, for inviting me to speak about this. It's something I'm quite passionate about. I've been involved with the California Invasive Plant Council as a board member for several years now, and started as staff just a year and a half ago. And it's a really important thing, and getting something coordinated nationally and being able to compare notes is a really fun thing to do. I've got a couple of other little garbagey things here that I'm trying to move out of the way. All right, so I'm going to be talking to you about our invasive plant list, and at CalIPC, we call it the invasive plant inventory. Just to start off, we're a little bit different than some of the rest of you. Wait a minute, I'm not getting here. There we go. In that we are a nonprofit organization. We have a statewide reach. We've been around since the early 90s, first as a volunteer organization, sort of invested in concerned land managers that first and foremost were very interested in getting a list together. So it was really one of the founding reasons for the organization to come together. Since the mid 2000s, we've been a fully staffed organization. Doug Johnson, we are happy and proud to have as our first and extending and continuing executive director. So it's great to also have him here involved, because he may be able to answer some questions that I can't, since he's been doing this for a lot longer than I have. So that's what we do. We really support land managers across the state, and that is through training, through providing informational materials, guidance in terms of prioritizing invasive plant species to manage for land managers, and more recently also really influencing policy statewide and supporting training. So the CalIPC inventory, so the inventory started, again, I told you that it was one of the reasons that our organization came together in the first place. It started in the mid 1990s. So I think we're proud to say we were one of the first states that really got a local or a statewide list going. It was formalized, and by formalized I mean kind of codified in these are the questions we're going to be asking, and this is the process that we're going to be following. As put a date on it, around 2006, when we published our inventory formally in for the first time. Since then, we've provided online access, and it's now used statewide by both agencies and local land managers as the primary plant prioritization resource for their management work. So we're really happy to see that. We do not operate in a vacuum. So the inventory that we have, our invasive plant inventory, is comprised, first, if you look at the bottom of the slide I have here, it's comprised of two things, and we've heard it from Tony and from Dia and from Teresa, that there's this predictive, and in Doug's introduction, there's a predictive need, and then there's a descriptive need. So the list really started out as a descriptive tool, and that is what we call our invasive plant list. More recently, we've added in a predictive component, which is our watch list. We have both of them compiled together into our inventory, but you can very easily see which is and the watch list because it says watch, and which is on the invasive list because it has a different ranking, a high, moderate, and limited, which I'll get into a little further later. The inventory, again, I was telling you, we do not operate in a vacuum. We are informed by a lot of different groups, and first and foremost, we get we're kind of a hub for getting reports from the field through our land manager network. And those usually come in and, conversations or emails, I'm worried about this species is spreading. And we have a listserv also that is a forum for that. So when we begin to see names of plants coming up, we snag those species and we just put them in a gigantic spreadsheet, which is our kind of our mother document for plants that are on our radar, for potentially invasive plants that are on our radar. We also work with the California Department of Food and Agriculture, CDFA for short. They have, as Teresa was mentioning, in Ohio, and also we heard in Florida, they have their own list, and that is a noxious weed list. It's the 4,500 list, and then they have their own scoring system. That scoring system is it's really, and the list itself, it is focused. It sort of was birthed from a need to support the agricultural community. So it has spread out, has broadened to be more applicable for a wildland community, but it originated sort of in that forum. So it weights in its evaluations, it weights economic input or impact pretty heavily. And it also is very focused, as most agricultural agencies, and we heard that also about APHIS, about new introductions, stopping things from coming into the state. So CDFA keeps a great watch over what comes into our borders and tries to evaluate, seed propagules, identify them, and if there's something new and potentially invasive, they move forward to scoring it. So that we kind of inform one another and work together, but we don't serve the same need. Then the third kind of group of folks that we are informed by and that we hope to inform is the horticultural community. The horticultural community is sort of the vehicle that is paying focused attention to them is Plant Right. Plant Right is an organization that is now overseen by the California, Doug, help me out, California Plant Alliance, that's what it is, the California Plant Alliance. And they are, their mission is to ensure that plants in the horticultural industry are not escaping out into the wild, so that we have some oversight into what is brought in and what is sold regionally. So they work to evaluate specifically horticultural plants and provide guidance to nurseries and to consumers as well. So from all of that, we're sort of feeding one another back and forth. We have a list of potential plants that we evaluate, and then we go through a process that I will describe to you to either choose the predictive tool or choose the descriptive tool to evaluate a species, and then to invite them into our list. So we do our best to follow the North American IPC guidelines. So we have an objective science-based approach, a committee with experts from around the state represented. We don't have a strict rule how many land managers, how many folks, from different disciplines are involved, but we have representation typically from the land manager, heavy representation from the land manager community, representation as best we can find from the horticultural community, and from the academic community. It's not a tight, constant committee, but it kind of comes together and then separates out again, and comes together, separates out. We have a transparent system. All of the gory details about our review process are available online. If you go to our plant inventory under the plants tab in cal-ipc.org, you can find, if you go into inventory details, you can find definitions for all of our rankings, and then you can, for every species, you can look at the plant assessment that we have. And that's there in perpetuity and can be updated as needed. We have a consistent methodology, as I mentioned, since 2006. We have been working to maintain the same, the same kind of questionnaire. Over time, of course, there are things that we have kind of come up to us that would be interesting to incorporate, but we keep our questions quite constant. We also have probably the area where it's a little squishy is the public review process. One could argue we have public review by the way that the species are first brought in to our attention, and towards the end, as we are finalizing our assessments and we announce them, we also have an opportunity for public review at that point in time. The assessment protocol is that the committee votes basically on, depending on the amount of funding that we have available, they vote on the species that are highest priority to assess. We pick an evaluator that is is well trained. Usually it's a PhD and someone who has has a lot of experience with either a particular group of invasive species or in general an invasive species. That assessment is done by that single person. It goes back to the committee and to a slightly larger group of stakeholders. Those folks weigh in and provide their feedback, and then we finalize it, and ultimately that is posted on the web. So let me go through some details of our plant assessment protocol. So for the first,
and Yuta, let me just jump in real quickly. In the interest of time, let's try to move through this fairly quickly because we're a little behind schedule. Okay.
Okay, that sounds good. So this is what I'm showing here on the screen is our plant assessment protocol for the descriptive protocol for plants that are already in the state. And the rating itself, we have 3 categories. We have limited, moderate, and high. We have a total of 13 criteria that we are evaluating, and that we are evaluating the plant on, and they are divided similarly to the other speakers in environmental impact, rate of spread, and ecological amplitude. This is an example of a scoring sheet. Again, the first set of questions are impact, the second are rate of spread, and the third are amplitude. And these are, they can be based on published material, they can be observational. There also is the opportunity to give not enough information there, an unknown rating. So based on the scores they receive, all of that is rolled up, and we get a final score of that gives the rating of limited, moderate, high, or it's not going to be included on the list because it rated too low. The second group is the weeds that are or the species that are being looked at using where we want to have a predictive sense of what might be happening in the future with them, we're using a plant risk evaluation tool that was developed by UC Davis in Joe DiTomaso's lab in collaboration with the University of Washington. That assessment tool is really for plants that are not yet widely distributed. The reason for that was the existing tool that we had was not, we could not use it for plants that we really didn't have any information, enough information about their spread or for in the state of California. This really supports early detection, rapid response. The pre-tool itself has 20 questions. They are divided out into, we have a category for climate matching using a simple modeling tool, impacts on native plants and animals, reproductive strategies, and dispersal. And again, we have three categories for this. And again, all of these would then be, if they are low, if they are of a high rating, they would be considered, they would be added into our inventory and called watch species. They would not be having a high invasive plant rating. They would be given a watch label. Evaluate further, we don't include those as yet, and low rankings, there's a particular scoring that is a cutoff for each of those. They are considered to be not a risk. And this is the tool that PlantRight also uses for their horticultural evaluations. We have about 224 species listed as invasive with that those first criteria, high, moderate, and limited, and then another 87 additional species that are listed, and that's as of since 2017 now, using this new tool with the pre-evaluation questions. Additional features, Teresa had mentioned that they've in Ohio been also adding tags sometimes for species that are of particular concern. We've added an alert tag to species that are in our inventory. It's a little bit more subjective. That is meant to alert folks about a species that has that moderate or high rating, and it's also really been observed to be spreading very quickly. And here are some examples of species that have these different ratings. Again, we have high, moderate, limited, and then the watch category. And just a snapshot of what our inventory looks like. There's a plant profile for each of these species. Everything's available to the public for free. And there are some cool applications that we have now been able to develop that use the ratings that we have in addition to species distribution information, and they help provide, again, regional guidance on what species might be becoming a problem soon in an area, really giving a land manager more tools to be able to make those decisions about what to focus on and what not to. And that is it.
Excellent. Thank you, Yuta.
Sure.
I'm struck by hearing about our list in the context of these other lists, how focused we are and have been historically on informing land managers as the primary goal versus what's okay and not okay to use in landscaping, which has come along later for us as a kind of a secondary function. And there have been some conflicts between those two. I think it's important to point out that the PlantRight program exists. It's a voluntary program. It exists because the state regulations for environmental weeds are not super strong, and the nursery industry here is large, and so it's not a given. We don't have a process like what Teresa explained, where there is a really engaged stakeholder advisory group bringing things forward. It's really on the State Department of Food and Agriculture, given what time and resources they have to add new things to their regulatory list. And it actually says in code that plants that have that are in agriculture should not be added. So that's a bit of a barrier as well. So things are evolving, but we are still very much focused on informing land managers and not on regulating landscape plants. And we are very funding dependent. So it's great to see universities involved in this. It would be wonderful if we could get the University of California to take on a function such as what University of Florida is doing, or to have an expert like you, Teresa, involved at the state level. And we have had that to some degree in the past when Jody Tomaso was there, but he's retired and that position has shifted. So really interesting to hear where other folks are at. And I think we'll certainly learn a lot from that. I think unless there are any burning questions, we should move on to a discussion about, I mean, boy, I could talk with you all day about these lists. It's really fascinating. And maybe that's something that we will do as an ongoing webinar series. But for now, I'm talking about the topic of potentially linking these lists at the national level. So let me see if I can grab the screen back. Change presenter. That's me. The screen. Get my GoToWebinar stuff out of the way. Okay. So make it full screen here. And switch the screens. Oh boy, start at the beginning, huh? All right. Okay, so just a quick prep for this conversation. I have seen a few things over the years that have talked about this, and this was one paper that came out several years ago proposing kind of an international standard system of rating invasive species. It probably stuck in my mind mostly because they figured out how to name all of these categories M, starting with an M. But there's more detail on massive, major, moderate, minor, and minimal. And I think, for instance, in our case, with a high, medium, and low coming out of our inventory, the massive, which is talking about huge stuff, and the minimal, which is talking about something that doesn't have an impact, really kind of drop out. And the major, moderate, and minor are basically what we end up with, at least in California. And it sounds like some of the other lists are somewhat similar. And I think that is all I wanted to show in terms of there being some standard being proposed out there. And so Chuck, if you're able to unmute folks or allow them to self-mute. I think last I saw we had some 40 people or something saying that, so about keeping yourselves on mute, but I think
Well, I think I muted everybody.
I got control back.
yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you now too, Doug. Okay. Well, I went.
Okay. And in the meantime, if the muting and unmuting is a challenge, I would say type things in the question bar to start the conversation going, and certainly the panel can share their ideas. Do you all, Teresa, you were mentioning how it would be nice to have a database of assessments that have been done as well as literature that people had used. What about actually seeing a map that says, okay, Ohio lists this, what about Indiana, et cetera?
Right. No, I've been thinking a lot about that. Yeah, the easy thing for me, well, easy, would be if, I mean, basic level, bottom level is to have a whole list of all the species that have been assessed by the states. The challenge is in updating that because the states keep updating their lists. So you have to have someone either on top of it or be plugging into some system where that's automatically pulled up. And then the literature is another thing that shouldn't be so difficult. But yeah, the map, I keep going back to the projection maps that Tony had showed, that Dia's been working on. Because to me, that's so powerful. And I'm a very visual person. So I'm trying to figure out a way where you can have that map to show where the species is, where its locations are, where it's projected to go, whether it's up or across or whatever. But then somehow the state, for that species, the different state indications of it. I don't know how to, it's almost like a three-dimensional thing to build.
Mm-hmm. So where it is, how it's rated, and its potential range, basically.
Yeah. So then states this gets more back to the predictive model, right? Or the predictive approach, where if you're a state and you're not yet in that range, but you could sort of see it moving northward, and you could see what other states are ranking it as, then you could be prepared and be on the lookout for it.
It sounds to me that, to fulfill that desire, I think we need to build a collaborative website database. And, the one that we put together for the assessment, we have 900 species in it. And, a person has to feed all that data into the actual website. However, we were able to create that thing for 20 grand, 25 grand. So I think it might be something, if it's, something that could be fundable, if there's a way to get a funding proposal together to throw that together, where you could have, the geopotential map. Here's what we think. Here's the distribution we think in our current conditions. Here's the distribution with, 25, 50, 100-year climate projections. And then here are links to all, so you wouldn't have to house all of the assessments, but you could provide links to, say, Hawaii's group, Tony's group, our group, your group. And that way you could cross, because we're talking state lists, university lists, federal lists, and different ways. The other thing I would say about that is that it would be important to be clear about whether or not you have used, it seems that we've fallen into three, like what the assessment has in 3 types of assessments, where there would be a cultivar assessment, a status assessment, or a predictive model. And I think that in terms of transparency, that would be something that would have to be in the front.
Yeah, and I'm seeing someone had a comment here. I'm looking at the questions. And there also was a question. Someone wants to know if they could see the questions. I don't know if it's possible. But yeah, there's a question about, along those lines, it seems like a good first step would be the National Clearinghouse, like EdMaps, of state lists with some database work on consistency in species names, which is a big problem, I'll tell you, from the public gardens thing. We discovered that quickly, and crosswalking the categories between states. And this is something like for Ohio, 2 of our questions, we actually now pull in whether a plant is a problem in an adjoining state. And we had a lot of discussion as to where you actually get that information, because there are so many lists, in the states. And so we're getting it from the state IPCs. But there's, so we have weirdness. So like for Kentucky, they have their list, but we don't count that. And I've worked with them a little bit on this too, and they're working on it. Their list is sort of just people coming together, talking, sort of like what we were doing in Ohio years ago. And so there's some states who I think are further along on the development of the assessment policies and the lists than other states. And I feel like there needs to be some way to standardize across the different states. Not necessarily their list, but I mean, even just what they call things. So like, what is your, top, middle, those types of things. There needs to be communication.
Yeah, Teresa, this is Tony here. I too have sort of dreamt of a sort of a national map with some type of a score or an indicator of the status of the species in every state. And, I thought, how would it be difficult? Well, it wouldn't be difficult to design sort of a national status assessment system. What would be difficult is to identify people or volunteers to assess these species for each state, and then to display that information on a website. But I think that would be very valuable, and I think we could design a very simple, minimal, basic status assessment that could describe the status of the species, looking at just a few things. First of all, percent of counties that it's in your state, number of, roughly, categories of number of sites, 1 or 2 sites, a dozen sites, or many sites. A question about the overall level of cover or density that it then creates within a site. And then some very basic questions about impact. Is it reducing native species? Is it altering fire regime? Just a few basic questions, not everything out there, because again, we want to keep this simple. And this kind of assessment has to be really is dependent on the people who share that information back with us. We can only glean so much from the published literature and even websites. So it would need to be relatively simple.
I think that's an important point, that basing on expert observations from the field is critical, in that we don't have, well, we have literature on some things, but certainly in terms of distribution and impact in any given place, that's going to be dependent on the people there.
I would add to this, in terms of the volunteer status assessment, that I think it's imperative to include those management, some element of the management difficulty or cost or something like that. I think that is very informative, at least for in Florida. It's been very informative for our land managers as well. So if something costs a lot more, or it's, you might have less individuals, but they're scattered around doing, having some ecosystem impacts, but it's harder to get to them. Like, the management difficulty will influence whether something becomes invasive, not recommended, or caution.
Could that be added as a separate tag? Because you have, number one, you have the issue that this plant is causing, and then you have your ability to do something about it. And they are, I know our land managers, at least, they sometimes get a little antsy about us trying to tell them what's easy and what isn't, because it kind of depends on, if you've got some gung-ho, folks that are willing to, hike out there every, 5 hours or whatever, to get to a site or have the particular tools, they may be able to take care of it. So the ease of management, I guess I still see it really, really important, and we don't have enough of information of it, but it is kind of separate from what the
impact and the distribution.
Yeah, and the distribution.
Well, I will say that I'm not telling the land managers what's easy or hard. They're telling me what's easy or hard. So that they're providing me the data about that. Like, oh, it costs more than $1,500 an acre. There are a bunch of discrete populations, and they're hard to get to. Well, that's gonna influence the final outcome of that assessment. In combination with impacts, in combination with establishment and spread. So that's how we do ours.
Yeah, I was gonna say that I see the value of that. I'm trying to figure out how this all works in my head, because for our assessment, we purposely excluded anything dealing with management costs and also economic costs, because we wanted just to focus on, is the species invasive or not? And then if it is invasive, then that's when that kicks in. Okay, if it has a high management cost, then it's of even greater concern. There was a question about any data on economic impact would be really useful too. I agree. I think there is some, for me personally, there is some danger, if I can use that word, in using economic costs, because I've also seen it used for my good old friend, the calorie pair, as if it's rated as invasive, and then because it is economically beneficial to a certain state who will remain nameless, then it was not listed, things like that. It becomes an excuse. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's hard to put it's hard to come up with a good, consistent way of assessing economic impact of an invasive.
Yeah.
So I think that could be a slippery slope. Yeah, go ahead.
There's a protocol now.
Yeah, there are ways.
Yeah, the SEI CAT, it's based on the ICAT, but it's socioeconomic impacts. I don't know how well it's been tested, but definitely up and coming along with the ICAT.
Does it actually have built-in quantifications for fire, water, sensitive species impacts, or do you have to kind of have some data?
I would have to look at that. I haven't looked at that one in a minute. We've been using the ICAT a bit at the assessment to do some horizon scanning work, but I haven't looked at that one quite yet as closely.
Gotcha. So Chuck, are we not able to include other folks on the audio?
I think I have to do it on a one-by-one basis. The unmute all did not seem to work for some reason.
Aha.
Well, although
Well, I have a question while we're working on that. One thing is establishing the threshold.
This is Rod Walker. I appear to be unmuted.
All right. Well, so that was Nancy. Can you introduce yourself with your question or your comment?
Hey, that's Nancy Lowenstein with NAIPC and Alabama Invasive Plant Council, and I'm working on revitalizing our assessment. And one, sticking point I came to was setting up thresholds between rankings. It seemed, to not just be, what is that based on? And I know with how Tony had it with looking at different species and having that data there and then breaking it out that way. But if you don't have that data to start with, how do you set those thresholds?
Right. Nancy, Tony here. So a recommendation, if you're developing a predictive assessment, then you would look at a specific, statistical model based on the status of known invaders and non-invaders in the state. If you're developing a status assessment, one way to approach the rankings would be to first design your assessment, then evaluate a bunch of species, and then look at the distribution of those scores, and then design the thresholds that way.
That's what we did for Ohio. We ended up going back and forth several times, but we had known invasives, the big bad ones, and then we had not, dandelion, for example, and then scattered ones in between. And we just ran a bunch through and just sort of see how they all aligned.
Right, that's what I was planning on doing, but it still seemed rather subjective.
It is, yeah. I mean, on some level, it's a little subjective, but as long as you you have to have some reason why you establish those thresholds and some way to explain that to others.
Yeah, and at the IPC assessment, most the tools that we use were developed before I arrived, but they did this for each of the status assessment and the modification of the AWRA for Florida. And that's why we have so many non-invaders in our database. A lot of them were through that validation process. I think Doria Gordon and Allison Fox put through like over 200 species to validate those tools. So.
But that's where something can help, because some of us who've done it for other states could suggest which ones, especially if you have an adjoining state. That's where we can pull in people to help other states.
Did I hear somebody, Mark or somebody, able to chime in off their mute?
That was Rod, I think.
Yeah, it appears they just have to unmute themselves now, I think.
This is Mark. I just unmuted myself.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right.
Do you have a
sorry,
question?
question. I was just trying to run out.
So I'm
Well,
just curious.
I will follow up with something later that we were going to talk about on this, but we do have all of the state lists and state laws databased, and that's what determines what species show up on invasive.org. There have been a few regional projects that, like MIPIN has a list that we've struggled to keep updated, but you can at least go on invasive.org, on the invasive plant atlas of the US, or on EdMaps and go to the species profile and see what state lists list it, and there's a link back to that original list. Now, the problem becomes that, there are different rankings and everything else, so we've left some of that out. I mean, it's in the database, but I don't think it shows up on the page, just to make it clear that because the rankings don't mean the same thing between different lists and laws as well.
But it sounds like you can drill down and look at any given list and how it lists that plant. How is that updated, Chuck?
I mean, we just have to at this point do it by hand, and we hadn't done it in a while, but we have recently updated all of them. It just takes somebody going to all the lists and pulling them.
I'm sure somebody could write an R code for that and auto-populate it.
Right, except some lists are just PDFs.
Well, that's where we'd have to have a standardized way of having states do it.
Which would be hard
Yeah.
to do for some of the laws, but for the list, it wouldn't be.
Yeah.
Is there any desire on a national level to get the invasive plant councils to come up with the same language for how we categorize species? Because I've been working on a project, and I think one of the biggest frustrating pieces was figuring out why are there Cat 1s, Class A's, B, C? Like, each of the states have come up with their own way to list these plants, when it seems to me it would make the most sense to either have a category 1, 2, and a watch list, or an ABC. Just come up with one way to report these things, so that then you could start talking about crosswalking across borders.
Well, I think that was the original intent of the ASTM standard, right? When we had that conversation a few years ago. Because ideally, yeah, that would be great.
I think the ASTM standard was to make sure that everybody's list was done well, but not necessarily to make sure that it was all the same format. But that's also been a parallel current in this entire thing, and that's part of what today's webinar is about. And I think I have a pretty healthy appreciation for each state's need to do things differently based on how things have evolved there. So I think it's kind of a yes, and if we can develop a standard that we can all crosswalk to, that seems like it allows us to have the individuality we need, but also provides that benefit of being able to mesh the lists.
So one of the things that I think you really need to take into account is a lot of these lists are in state law, and you're not going to be able to change the law to change those categories. I have a quick question for Tony. Is with USDA plants, when are we ever going to get those lists of what's regulated in a state updated on there? We've been asking for years to get the web manager to get those updated, and people look to that as what's accurate, and it's not. It's not even close.
I'm sorry, get what updated?
The website, the USDA plants, PLANTS, the big website that everybody goes to in USDA.
Yeah. They're having a lot of sort of issues maintaining the site, funding, things like that. So they're working on a major update. I don't know what that update entails. But they are aware of these issues, and they're trying to stay on top of them, but they are struggling with some issues.
Yeah, I've been told that same thing for the last 5 years, and we've been asking them to get, just get our list updated on their website, and they're not doing it. And it causes legal problems for us because people say, come to us and say, oh, well, the USDA says that this isn't regulated in my state, and so it must not be.
Yeah, no, you're right. That it can cause a nightmare.
Yeah,
But
so maybe
I
if
really
they could use Chuck's list and just reference to Chuck's list if he's going to be keeping it updated.
And this also sounds like the kind of thing that the National Association of IPCs can weigh in on. Tony, if you know the best person to direct this request to, that's the kind of thing where we could send a letter and try to elevate the level of the request.
Yeah, no, certainly. You can reach out to me and I can give you the name of the person in charge of the plants database.
Okay.
This is Claire from MIPIM. It's been mentioned a couple times. We have kind of a master list for 8 states in the Midwestern region. And I just wanted, I guess, to reiterate that it really is a challenge to keep it up to date. I probably updated it at least twice a year, every year since I started in 2017 to keep it accurate. And that's just for 8 states. And it's still not always absolutely reflective. So it's going to be a continued challenge unless we can, I guess, come up with something automated or.
I would nominate Mia because she knew some fancy sounding code that maybe we could write that would automatically harvest these things. So sounds like she knows how to do it.
I just surround myself with really smart people.
Well, that counts. That'll work. But it does mean, all kidding aside, it does seem like between entities like University of Florida, University of Georgia, et cetera, that there is the expertise out there to move forward on this. It would just take a chunk of money and not a very big chunk of money. So one thing we can do is we can reach out to agency partners and our friends at the National Invasive Species Council and just see what recommendations they have. There are I don't know if other folks are hearing any rumblings of potential stimulus funding coming through federal agency grants, but if there was a possibility to access that for a project that would not only design the technical aspect, but also do support the outreach necessary to get people engaged in addressing this, that's a possibility. Something we should stay tuned for. Well, I am aware of the time, and I'm happy to keep chatting with folks. It sounds like people are able to unmute now. I do want to, let people know they are free to go, of course, at any time. And let's keep talking for a few minutes. But I also want to invite people to participate in a working group on this topic so that we can keep talking about it and figure out how to move forward. Because I think it'd be a shame to let the barriers, such as they are, stop us from getting to something we can see that's just right there. So I don't know how we want to do that. Certainly you can email me directly. I sent out the original invite for this invitation for this webinar, so you can email me, or you can unmute yourself and volunteer now.
Everybody will get an email from me automatically as a follow-up. So if they want to just respond to that email, then I'll put everybody on a list and we can go that way. Because tomorrow you'll get an email from GoToWebinar, and if you respond to it, it'll come back to me. This is Chuck, and then we can put you on a list from there. And I'm assuming we're going to make this recording available, but I'll ask the presenters if they're okay with that.
I would love it if you could, because I actually scribbled down a few names of people here in California that I would have liked to invite, thinking about it after the fact. So it'd be great to be able to send them a recording. Does the recording have both the audio and the visual?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. So it should have a full recording, so we can put this up on YouTube and then share it from there.
Sounds good. Any Any burning questions or comments from attendees?
Hi, my name is Susie. I'm from the Michigan Department of Agriculture. And it's not really a question, just a comment that I want to say. I'm very interested in sharing information. I think it was Teresa mentioned sharing literature. We're working on doing weed risk assessments. I had the training with Tony Coop in Maryland last year. And but it's been hard to find time to get the assessments done with so many other things on our desks, on our plates. And so, why reinvent the wheel, I guess is the saying. If the work's already been done, I would love to share and share what we've done as well. We've assessed a lot of aquatic species in Michigan, being surrounded by the Great Lakes, but we're definitely behind in assessing terrestrial species. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there that we're very interested in that.
And I just add there are a few challenges in sharing the literature, and that's copyright issues. And I only say that because I'm an editor of a journal and I work with Wiley in particular. So the way there's no restriction if you share it between two people, but like if I sent a paper that's under copyright and I sent it to a big wide listserv, then I could be in trouble. So what I've been doing is I have all the literature for all the species in a Dropbox. That's how I just have it all organized by species. And then like I've shared it with different states, who wanted. So, but it would be nice to have a different way to do that.
That's a good solution. I mean, I think even just sharing the citations, for this species, these papers were useful.
Yeah, and we have that, people could see that on our assessment online, but it's even better if you could actually send someone, here's the whole group of papers, have fun, and if you add anything new, send it back to me so I can add it.
Definitely.
And Doug, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I think I successfully unmuted myself. It took a couple of clicks and dialing in on my phone. This is Jeff Morset with the National Invasive Species Council staff. Really interesting conversation. Glad that the invitation got sent out, so I was able to listen in. And this would certainly be kind of following the lead of Tony and others within the agencies, whereas NISC doesn't have much of a staff, but rather tries to coordinate and facilitate. To me, I think there is some opportunity for interagency discussion on this, where you have the integrated taxonomic information system at USGS. You have the non-native aquatic species, which does deal with plants, USGS as well. And of course, you've got the plants database that USDA has and leading the charge. So the National Invasive Species Council and the agencies involved with that, look to sort of have priority actions every year. And, in the next couple of months, we'll be formulating what the priorities would be for 2021. I think it's an interesting idea to think about working with the plant councils across the states, as well as the federal land management agencies, because these federal lands are within those states, and if the Park Service is looking at a different list than the state in which it resides, that could be obviously problematic or challenging, as well as forests and other land management locations and jurisdictions. So, I would sort of sign up to be a part of the working group, again, following Tony and the others within the agencies that are doing the heavy lifting, but to look for those areas where interagency work might be facilitated by our role. And I think an example of that is a recent exchange with the National Science Foundation's funded National Ecological Observatory Network. So these are 60 sites across the country, and they're trying to see what lists they use to have their folks doing field work watch for invasives on these neon sites. And they're going out every couple of days. And so that might be something that would slip through the cracks, and where the National Invasive Species Council, NISC, can help ensure those connections or look across that kind of horizon of federal agencies. So I would be excited to be a part of it. I think we could think about some interagency and IPC's coordination on some action going forward in 2021. Of course, I can't promise anything. It's at the kind of review and discretion of the agencies and the senior advisors within those agencies. But the time might be right in the next month or two to consider such a topic, and then we'd have to see how it boiled up to as a priority within the administration. But it's probably worth putting it forward and staying in touch.
That's great. Thanks for joining the webinar and for offering that ray of hope. It does seem like a great opportunity. Should we work on, probably makes sense to work on a bit of a scope of work and budget of what this would take. And I don't know if that means, Dia, Chuck, inviting some of the technical folks from your end, because that is one of the aspects to this. I think, the people on this call can talk about the invasive species listing aspects, but there's the need for a streamlined system to pull the information together, especially to keep things updated.
I'm curious with, what's going on in the world right now, invasive species, I think there's an opportunity to capitalize on a terrible situation, but we're living through a lesson on exponential growth. So, I mean, there's a way to frame this, but also, at least at my university, research is canceled. Like, there's no research happening at all, probably until the spring. There's some discussion of, or at least classes, maybe not until the spring. Research, they're trying to figure out how to get people back out in the field. So I wonder if the opportunity is going to arise to get funding that might have been available to go out and do field work, to be doing more of these kinds of like at the computer, data driven, or developing a website or compiling information, or thinking about it from an extension position as well. We might have funding opportunities that weren't available 6 months ago. So I don't know, maybe I've just been thinking about this for my own personal program, like, what kind of data-driven stuff can I come up with for my grad student who just lost his whole thesis? So just a thought there.
Yeah.
I'm in the same boat, Dia. So I totally agree. And I'm running a department, so I have tons of graduate students freaking out and faculty in the same situation. But yeah, that would be ideal.
And anybody else?
Yeah, hi, this is Ryan Gulick with the Lower Hudson Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. I had a question / comment about including economic aspects when you're assessing a plant. And I tend to agree with Teresa that they should be a little bit more separate. So I'm working on trying to get species added to the New York prohibited species list, and it seems like they weight heavily the economic aspect when they're assessing these plants. And in my mind, I think about how if a plant is regulated statewide, yes, that could impact landscapers in the nursery business. But they could just sell another plant. They could have a grace period to get rid of their stock and then just sell something else. Is there any thought behind that as to why the economic aspect should be so heavily, weighted?
I think it depends upon the state and the dynamics going on in the state. So in Ohio, what we ended up doing is we do have a phase out period. The calorie pair, for example, is on a 5-year phase out period, and that's going to be officially banned from regulation, commercial sale and distribution in 2023. Lithium virgatum had a 1-year phase out, and that's gone now from commercial sale. So that's what we've done. But it really, in my experience, it depends upon the state and how important is the nursery component. But New York, I would assume, would be pretty big. Florida is pretty big.
Mm-hmm. I will say we benefit in Florida that people don't want their names associated with at this point. So maybe not in the past, but now most of the growers that we deal with want to do the right thing. They just aren't as risk averse as we are.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And the nice thing too about the public garden project that we're working on is trying to figure out more of a predictive approach, you know, what plants that have just been introduced into public gardens are starting to be a problem. And then if we could let, you know, obviously the other gardens know to be on the lookout, but also ideally down the line to let the nursery industry know, or those people developing new species, or I shouldn't say species, cultivars, so they know, hey, this is, you know, this one is not a good idea, you know, you need to start rethinking, you know, let's give you a few years to rethink and like have time to come up with an alternative. Because I mean, the reality is the nursery industry, I mean, they have to make money, right? And so we have to give them the means, either it be alternatives, but I mean, I think the powerful thing we can do is let them know that, hey, this plant is starting to be a problem. You got to start thinking about phasing that out and working on an alternative as fast as possible.
Yeah, all right, thank you. It seems like a pretty simple solution to have a phase out period and just sell other plants. But I just wanted to create some discussion about that. Thank you.
Well, I think in general, there's a potential fear of it being a slippery slope. Like, okay, you want to take this plant and this plant off the shelf, where does it stop? So it sounds like, for instance, in Florida, there's a history of this dialogue going on, so that the perspectives have evolved, and perhaps there's an acknowledgement that it's a real problem. I will pay a cost in terms of the optics if my business is distributing an invasive plant, and we know that it's not going to be everything. You're really going after things that are bad, and there's plenty of other things we can sell. So it might just take a while to get there. I feel like we're still in that situation in California, to be honest, where I think there's just a lot of concern that, you know, we don't want to open the door to anything regulatory because it's just too dangerous to the industry. So I think building trust over time is a big part of it. Other questions and thoughts?
Just real quick, engaging master gardeners, just, you know, specific to the horticulture questions and getting the buy-in from the nursery growers. You know, at least the environmental hort department has our Florida friendly landscaping website, which is yet another list of species, but they aren't allowed to recommend species that are invasive not recommended based on the IPC assessment. So it's a nice push to the nursery growers. They want to get their, or the breeders, they want to get those species onto that list, because then the university's promoting them so that people can get yard certification. So I think it's, you know, it's been this sort of synergy of like different programs and stuff integrating at a certain point to where it's in the best interest at this point for the growers to go for the non-invasive route.
I'd also add in the landscape architects to that too, because we've started to work with them.
Yep.
Yeah. There's a question from James here. I don't know if you guys saw that. It's an interesting one. In some cases, multiple entities within a state are creating invasive species lists, like departments of ag, natural resources, universities, nonprofits, et cetera, using varying methodologies, and some with regulatory authority and some not, which can create angst, pro and con, from a public and horticultural industry perspective, including watch lists. Have any of you run into this issue? And do you think there is a way to avoid this problem? That's the problem of my life right now.
Yeah, we wrote the EDIS document to try to help people. I mean, it's the #1 question I get when I give extension talks. How is your list different than these other 5 lists in the state? So yeah, it's a huge problem.
Yeah, in Ohio, so our list that we do is the official state list. And so that's what I meant earlier, when one of our questions, we deal with it, whether a species is listed as a problematic or invasive in another state, then I have to go to that state and say, okay, what is their official state list? And it's interesting. So yes, I've run into that problem. It's a problem.
Yeah, we have as well. Definitely. But I mean, they have a slightly different focus, you know, and I think that's something people don't see when they see a list. You know, what made it, what got it created, and you know, we still have to figure out ways of making that clearer to people.
Yeah, and I'm not sure, you know, if there's any easy solution for that, or I don't foresee us solving that anytime in the near future, because again, everybody has a different scope. You know, the IPCs, for example, tend to focus on weeds of natural areas. Well, what about the agricultural weeds, right? That's a whole other group of people that are working on that. And so we're always going to be faced with this challenge, but I think it's important that no matter what the list, that it's clear at the top, what is the scope of the list? How were these weeds evaluated and listed? What was the process?
I'm seeing a question here about possibly collaborating with NASMA, the North American Invasive Species Managers Association. And yeah, Ryan, that's a good thought for sure.
I will say I'm a board member for NASMA, and I don't know if there's a way to. I'm the chair of the Standards and Technology Committee. If there's a way, once we move forward, you know, this is something that I could easily bring to the group. I think they would be interested in it. I can't speak for the executive folks, but it seems right up their alley.
Great. Yeah, I know National IPC is, you know, has been in conversation with Bell about, you know, how do we best mesh the efforts of our groups to have the most synergistic effect. So this is perhaps a really good project to work on together. Mm-hmm. Other thoughts out there before we cut? Well, it's lunch hour here in California, but it's afternoon where some other folks are. Other thoughts or comments? Going once? All right. Well, you're all officially signed up for the working group. We'll meet you here again in a week. No, actually though. So when you do get the kind of follow-up automatically generated email from Chuck's webinar application, please do respond to that if you are interested in talking about this more. I don't think it has to all be about one topic. I think we can decide, you know, there may be multiple things that we want to talk about. I can certainly envision us talking about how to make a list in the first place, how to share resources for making lists so that we're not reinventing the wheel, but then how to make our lists talk to each other and crosswalk as best as possible, and then how to build on that by building a system that will bring them together. The whole idea of the range mapping that Tony showed, I think that's really interesting. We've done a little bit of that, and I know we can do some plants, we have challenges with other plants, so it'd be great to establish a common way of doing that and have that done for every plant. I think that'd be super useful. So there are a number of different ways this could go, and then there's the funding to make it happen. So I'd love to have an active working group. So let's volunteer if we have the time and interest, and we'll send out information to those interested on a follow-up call. Any final words from panelists or Chuck or anybody else?
Well, I'd just say thanks, Doug and Chuck, for pulling this off. This is great.
Yeah, thank you all for all.
Yep, appreciated.
Yeah, thank you all for being here and for being such great invasive plant listers. It's inspiring.
Listers.
All right. Well, with that, stay healthy, stay strong, and we'll talk soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.